Hello and welcome to Radical Democracy. I'm Maddi. Cheers. Thank you for joining us here on Strong Island Radio. And today's topic is rescuing democracy from panic politics, the indigenous solutions. So what do I mean by panic politics and what brought this up to begin with? Why did I pick this topic? So I'm reading a few weeks ago, I pick up the week, and in it was an article entitled, "Will Climate Change Destroy Democracy?" And shortly thereafter, I'm listening to NPR in the morning, and there's an expert from one of the climate change think tanks on who is saying that, well, democracy really isn't that good for climate change solutions. Maybe we should look to China. That would be the same China that is the world's number one polluter, the same China that just promised to use more coal, and that is mining in the Amazon. So I was pretty confused by that one. And I also, in that same week or this past week, I got a notice about indigenous people trying to get a seat at the table in the mainstream climate change movement. And they can't seem to get listened to, which is really ironic since they are the only people that over all of these years have been consistently dedicated to protecting the earth and consistently dedicated to trying to get the rest of us on board with them. So I found all of this pretty interesting, and then I was thinking about why in the world would you want to do away with democracy because it's too slow. Democracy is the most enlightened form of government. It needs some fine-tuning, but it's the one that gives us the most freedom, the most options. I don't think we need less democracy. I think we need more and better democracy so that we are looking to people who live in an environment where they can give us those creative solutions. So there's a lot floating around in politics now. Sometimes I feel like it's that song, clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right. Here I am stuck in the middle with you. On one side, we've got everybody wants to be a Marxist. And on the other side, we've got everybody wants to do nothing. So somewhere in the middle, there is this answer. And the indigenous people have it. They have that answer for us. They have it for us in terms of improving democracy, and they certainly have it for us in terms of taking care of the earth. And I want to go back to a gentleman named Russell Means. Russell Means was an Oglala Lakota native rights activist. He was a member of the American Indian movement that was fighting for indigenous rights here in this country back in the 70s. And he wrote a very interesting article in 1980 when people were trying to convince him to join the communist movement, the socialist movement. And the article is all about how indigenous people are neither Marxist nor capitalist in nature. And the most interesting part of that article to me, I'd like to read here. This is from Russell Means. Revolutionary Marxism, like industrial society in other forms, seeks to rationalize all people in relation to industry. And you could slide in there business. Maximum industry, maximum production. It is a doctrine that despises the American Indian spiritual tradition, our cultures, our lifeways. Marx himself called us pre-capitalists and primitive. Pre-capitalist simply means that in his view, we would eventually discover capitalism and become capitalists. We have always been economically retarded in Marxist terms. The only manner in which American Indian people could participate in a Marxist revolution would be to join the industrial system, to become factory workers or proletarians, as Marx called them. The man was very clear about the fact that his revolution could only occur through the struggle of the proletariat, that the existence of a massive industrial system is a precondition of a successful Marxist society. Gee, that's what we all want to grow up to be, right? Factory workers. That's your choice, unless you're going to be in the ruling party. I'm going to continue. I think there's a problem with language here. Christians, capitalists, Marxists, all of them have been revolutionary in their own minds, but none of them really means revolution. What they really mean is continuation. They do what they do in order that European culture can continue to exist and develop according to its needs. So let us not forget that Marxism, communism, socialism, all of these are Western hierarchical constructs. So I'm going back to Russell now. So in order for us to really join forces with Marxism, we American Indians would have to accept the national sacrifice of our homeland. We would have to commit cultural suicide and become industrialized and Europeanized. At this point, I've got to stop and ask myself whether I'm being too harsh. Marxism has something of a history. Does this history bear out my observations? I look to the process of industrialization in the Soviet Union since 1920, and I see that these Marxists have done what it took the English Industrial Revolution 300 years to do, and the Marxists did it in 60 years. I see that the territory of the USSR used to contain a number of tribal peoples, and that they have been crushed to make way for the factories. The Soviets refer to this as the national question, the question of whether the tribal peoples had the right to exist as peoples, and they decided the tribal peoples were an acceptable sacrifice to the industrial needs. I look to China, and I see the same thing. I look to Vietnam, and I see Marxists opposing an industrial order and rooting out the indigenous tribal, I look to Vietnam and I see Marxists imposing an industrial order and rooting out the indigenous tribal mountain people. Now, since this article was written, the USSR, or the Union of Soviet Socialist Not Republic, has fallen apart. And for those of you who remember the pledge with the republic, neither China nor the USSR is a republic. A republic is a government of, by, and for the people. So if you've got elitists in power and the people are not voting you in, the only way you can possibly really have a republic is if you have some sort of democratic process. So the USSR is gone, and because their economy collapsed. Taking note of that, communist China is also gone. Also, the People's Not a Republic of China, they are gone, and they have turned to authoritarian capitalism. And exactly as Means predicted, they are busy eradicating native people or re-educating them, as in the case of the Uyghur Muslims, where they are forcing sterilization upon their women, which is tantamount to genocide, because they are a very small group. So if they cannot reproduce, obviously, ultimately, they will disappear. So no one in all of this very serious stuff is talking to any indigenous people. And while they're not talking to any indigenous people, they are also in panic mode. We all know about the young lady that stood up in front of the United Nations and said, "We need to panic. I want you to panic like your house is on fire." Name me one person that ever made a good decision when they were panicking. And that is why Winston Churchill made his famous statement about be calm and carry on. Your brain is incapable of making any kind of decent decision if you are in panic mode or fear mode. So I'm going to repeat something I read last week when we were talking about the power of positivity. And this comes from the article on neuroplasticity. And it talks about when you have negative thoughts, panic thoughts, here's how your brain reacts, okay? It slows down brain coordination, makes it difficult to process thoughts or find solutions, hinders creative ability, decreases activity in the cerebellum, impacts the left temporal lobe, and this fear factor affects your mood, your memory, and your impulse control. Gee, that's exactly the state of being I want to be in when I'm making important decisions about the world. I don't think so. So obviously, that's a very bad piece of advice. You don't want to panic when you have to make a decision as big as climate change. Then let's look at what your brain does if you're positive, if you're grateful, if you're calm. Here's what your brain does. Synapses, the areas connecting neurons, increase dynamically. It increases mental productivity by improving cognition, intensifies your ability to pay attention and to focus, what you need in order to make a good decision. Improves the ability to think and analyze incoming data, and improves the ability to solve problems quicker and enhance creativity. So, obviously, panicking is not the way to go. And what we've got going on politically in our country is the fear factor. This side is making the other side afraid, and everybody's running around just being afraid. Oh, if I don't vote for this one, the sky's going to fall. It's like the Chicken Little syndrome going on out there. Everybody's acting like if you don't elect me, the sky will fall. The sky is falling. This is what we hear all throughout the West, but I'm not hearing it. I don't hear it among indigenous people. I do hear very similar things to what Russell Means had to say here. I do hear that they are afraid that if we start instituting these old Western ways of looking at the world that disrespect any form of spirituality, that they will become extinct. And to not give the very people who have been warning us and protecting us for so long about what has been going on the earth is just unthinkable. And they're the only ones telling us the truth also, because a lot of what's going on in the climate change movement is this lie. A lot of the way they're trying to get what they want done and force people into going their way is they're trying to say that, oh, if we turn off all our cars tomorrow and ground all our planes and stop using coal and do all of that, we can reverse climate change, which is ridiculous. We cannot. There will be climate change no matter what we do as people. It has already started, and a good deal of it has very little to do with us as human beings. Could we help? Yes. Could we clean up the water? Yes. Should we stop Nestle from charging for water when people need to survive? There should be no profit in water. I mean, should we clean up and protect all of our drinking water? Should we look for a more equitable economic distribution system? Yes. But at the same time, we should not put into power people who want to be in power and simply want to control you. And Lord knows we should slow it all down. We do not need to make this decision in haste. The sky is not falling tomorrow. Over the last just couple of years, it was going to fall in 30 years. Then now it's 12 years. Then it's 9 years. And I think people need to get their act together. But certainly, even climate change aside, what's going on in political America right now is this fear factor. So we're trying to keep the voters in this constant state of off balance and in this constant state of fear. And so we're not looking to the people who are calm. Not that I want us to look to China because they're calm. They're not panicking over there. So I don't want us to do that. I'm talking about the people who have a spiritual connection to this land, who always have had a spiritual connection and knowledge of the earth. So to that end, I have asked my husband, Robert Vedder, anthropologist, healer, and philosopher, to please join us and to kind of give us his take on what's going on in the world right now and leaving the indigenous voices out of this discussion, whether it's out of politics or economics or climate change.
Well, clearly the indigenous voice is left out, and it's left out for a variety of reasons, but one is that it's expedient to leave it out because if we acknowledge them as peoples, it means that they have rights in the world.
Right.
And so there's been a reason to leave them out of all conversations that have to do with the public stage, with the international arena. Now, the United Nations is supposed to be the arbiter of all of this. Right. I mean, they are at least an attempt to create some international forum for these things to be discussed. But we're going to tease apart this whole notion of indigenous voices. So what I'd like to talk about is what indigenous people have to tell us specifically about democracy, what they have to tell us about taking care of the earth, and what indigenous groups tell us about the nature of the world. So to begin with, having indigenous voices is a way of saying these groups of people have a right to exist.
Yes.
And when you gave the example of the former Soviet Union crushing indigenous groups, it points to the problem with a world government.
Yes.
Yes.
If everything becomes one single society, then there's no room for indigenous groups. There's no room for differences.
Right.
So that's maybe the first important issue, is to talk about, do we need a world government? Should there be one government for the entire earth? Now, from the perspective of the environment, that's one excuse, that if you had one government, maybe you could get things done in a global way. Mm-hmm. Creating that is at the expense of any cultural differentiation. So
Right.
certainly as a cultural anthropologist, the idea of that horrifies me, because I think that what creates a good globe is the fact that we do have diversity of peoples, diversity of culture, diversity of our understandings of ourselves and others.
Right.
So the first step is certainly to honor and respect indigenous people and to give them their specific rights, to honor them as sovereign nations.
Exactly.
And when it comes to the United States, I mean, we are as bad an example as anybody on the planet. And I say that because, I mean, it's easy to point to. You mentioned pointing to China. And in the article, they talked about pointing to Vietnam. But we could just as easily point to the United States and say that we have a terrible track record.
Absolutely.
We have in one way, we have a good track record of tribal sovereignty, but the way that we got to it was not because of honoring them in any way. It was an odd legal loophole that allowed them to be sovereign nations. And the way that began was because the United States entered into treaty agreements. The young, fledgling United States entered into treaty agreements with various tribes. Now, if we look back at those agreements, we can find that every single treaty that the United States ever signed with an Indian nation, we violated.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing, the important part of that from a legal perspective, is that once the United States entered into a treaty agreement with any given tribe, it indirectly ascribed to them a nation status. Why? Because the United States as a country cannot enter into a treaty agreement with an entity, for example, like a state. A state can't be a sovereign nation, but an
Exactly.
Indian tribe can be a sovereign nation. So we did, in effect, give them sovereign rights, not because we necessarily wanted to, but as a legal loophole that gave them that right. And that's why, for example, if anybody listening is wondering, well, why is it that an Indian tribe gets to have a gambling casino? And the answer is because legally they are not bound by the regulations of the state in which that reservation or that Indian piece of land exists. They are
Exactly.
not subject to the state regulations. They have a formal relationship as a nation-to-nation status with the United States government. So they are nations within a nation.
So that's a very important point. And I think a lot of people really don't understand that. And I think that though it wasn't, like you said, it wasn't intentionally done with good heart, it has given them that status. And in order to take that status away, if we go through with some of the plans that some people on the way far left have about rewriting the Constitution, about instituting Marxist economics, which I'm not even going to get into that here, but any of these things that would require a much bigger government in order to impose on the people, they would end up having to take those lands back. There's much more of a threat, as Russell Means points out in this article, there's much more of a threat from that style of government than from the democracy that we have right now. There's much more of a threat to all of us from that style of government, but it's certainly a threat to indigenous people as it has been in the past. And I think, when we're talking about Marxism or communism, to me, one of the things that is so irksome about it is its assumption that people are bad. It's like people are bad and they need a lot of regulation and they need a lot of watching out over, because otherwise their worst intentions are going to come, and we're going to have this group of people sitting up here that's going to tell everybody else what to do because we're what? That's my question too with world government. What are you? What and who are you that makes you the person that should rule the world or the people that should rule the country? Who are you? So that idea of who is it that we're going to make into this world government has to be addressed before we can even come close. And we are not addressing it because why? We're panicking. And everybody is panicking, so nobody can think clearly. Whereas, as you know, as we've discussed on this show, the plan for world peace was given to the Haudenosaunee by the peacemaker, and it's called the Great Law of Peace. And what is it? It is a fine-tuned democracy. The reason I call this show Radical Empowerment is because it requires we, the people, to take hold of our own power, to say we have a right to be here. We are equal to you. And here's what I'm willing to do in order to claim my power. Here's the way I'm willing to function within a community setting. So that is what I'd like to really speak to, is where do these teachings from the Great Law of Peace, or even from the structure of the Lakota or any of these native peoples of this land, these First Nations, where do these First Nations have information for us?
Well, I think, first of all, we've talked about the form of government, the type of democracy that we learn about from the Haudenosaunee under the direction of the peacemaker. And something that we certainly left out in our version of it is instructions on how to find a leader.
Exactly.
And we have no instructions on how to find a leader. And I wish I remembered the exact statistic on this, but there is a sickening percentage of voters who decide on a leader based on what that person looks like.
Oh, yeah. Exactly.
And so we have no instructions. We get caught up in the media frenzy and hype about one leader versus another leader. And in the end, no matter who we end up with, it's someone of poor moral character.
Exactly.
In my opinion.
No, well, in my opinion, too. And I think that's being played out when you really listen to what people are saying. They're backtracking. They want to take away your freedom. They want to give you back your freedom. You can't possibly be responsible enough to have freedom. They lie about statistics. They put themselves in the position, really, of being a king or a queen, where I'm so much smarter than you, and just ignore the fact that I lied about this or the fact that I did that. We're just going from here because I'm just so smart and I really, really care about you. This is why I'm always telling people you need to watch the candidates with the sound off. Because if you do, it will tell you a lot. Because you can tell if somebody's lying to you. You can tell if they're self-serving. And then if you turn it on, listen to the tone of voice. Don't listen. They're all going to promise you stuff that have we ever elected a president that kept his promises? Or hurt? Well, we've only had a him. But it'll be exciting to see if we do get a woman, if she keeps her promises. And that is the problem that the Haudenosaunee identified when they said, if you want power, we're never going to give it to you. So they're looking at those character qualities and looking at leadership. And sure as heck, if we are going to have a world government, we better have some people of good character who are putting us before themselves. Not that I think we should have a world government. Don't get me wrong. But
So the question is, what can we learn from this? Well, first, we may have talked about this before, but what are the qualities that we should be looking for in a leader?
we can't repeat this enough. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, we should look for somebody who is a family man or woman, for that matter. A person who you can observe from the way that they treat their family that they're concerned about somebody other than themselves.
Exactly.
And for the Haudenosaunee, that meant somebody who had been married, had not been divorced, and had a minimum of 3 children.
And that speaks to, it speaks to more than it sounds like on the surface. Because married, not divorced, talks about commitment. So if you can make a commitment to another person and follow through, if you can make a commitment to your children and follow through, that says a lot about who you are as a person. So that commitment is extremely important, that ability to commit. And when they talk about the family, if you don't have children, and that's another thing that was brought up at the climate change thing, is not having children. Nobody have children. The world's going to fall apart, Chicken Little. So, don't have any kids. Well, if you don't have kids, do you really have an investment in the future? And let me just point out at this point, all this stuff about not having children and all the population explosion impacting climate change, impacting the environment. And then you have people like Jack Ma of Alibaba and Elon Musk of Tesla coming out and saying, wait a minute, the real problem is population collapse, the complete collapse of economies because you have no young people. So there's a balance somewhere, but we're just not looking for the balance because we're in fear and panic mode, and we're allowing ourselves to be in fear and panic mode because we're spending a whole lot too much time listening to these people on the news who are no smarter than you. But you are going to have to do that research. You're going to have to listen. You're going to have to look. Mostly you should read and not listen to what's going on the mainstream news. Go ahead.
Back to our qualities?
Back to our qualities.
So the next
This is kind of like our marriage, isn't it, honey? Whenever I have Bob on, this is kind of the way we talk. I go off, and Bob brings me back. Go.
The next quality that we can discuss is a peaceful person. Mm-hmm. A person who has not committed violence through either his acts or his words.
Yep.
It tells us something about the way that person interacts with others. The next one that we can talk about is that a person who has never lied or cheated or stolen anything ever in his life. And that's certainly hard to find, isn't
Yes.
it? He has skin 7 layers thick. And what they mean by that is a person who will not immediately get upset when he is criticized by other people, because a leader is absolutely going to be criticized. So the kind of person who gets upset and starts yelling back, somebody who loses their patience, loses their cool under fire. So that this is really a person who can think for himself.
Who can be calm and carry on. Hello. Go ahead, sorry. Not me, but go ahead.
He's a humble man. So he doesn't constantly have to tell you about how he's better than everybody else.
Right.
He's serving as an example to the people through the way he acts.
Yep.
He's kind in the way that he treats others. He's generous toward other people. So this kind of leader will never end up being wealthy, because if somebody needs something, they go to him, and he's the kind of man who will give to them what they need. He's respectful toward others. He shows responsibility. And then, of course, the one that you just mentioned, which was never having campaigned. And that one, in a way, that one has the deepest and farthest reaching implications. Because if you are the kind of person who wants power, you can never get enough power. There is a greed for power.
Right.
And so when you get power, you're always trying to get more and more and more. So the question is the kind of man who wants power over other people, in the end, is he looking for the well-being of the people? No, he's looking out for the well-being of himself.
Right.
And that's why
Or herself.
Yeah, it's right. It's so it could always be her in every time that I'm saying him.
Exactly.
But that's why for Haudenosaunee women, who I didn't mention this before, the men are the leaders, the women are the ones who vote the men into office and have the power of impeachment. But what these Haudenosaunee women are trying to find, ironically enough, is a man to take on a job who doesn't want that job in the first place.
Exactly.
And you might say, well, that sounds kind of ridiculous that you're trying to fill a job with somebody who doesn't want to have the job. And the reason that he doesn't want to have that job is if you take it on, you are accepting a responsibility until the day you die for the people, where you commit to putting the needs of other people ahead of yourself or even ahead of your immediate family. And that's a recipe for a difficult life.
Exactly.
Not a cushy life where you're going to reap the benefits off of everybody else's back. That's making your life a life of sacrifice for everybody else.
Exactly.
And that's why when the women offer this man this position, he usually tries to say no, because clearly, I mean, most people don't want that in their lives. And so when the women offer it to him, he may immediately try to say no, and then the women end up having to convince him to say yes to this nomination, convince him that it's his responsibility for the collective, for the nation, that he should take on this responsibility. So if he takes it on, he agrees to continue as leader until the day he dies or until the women remove him from office. So clearly, if we as a country gave specific instructions like this or something similar to our people, first of all, we wouldn't have the candidates that we have right now.
Oh, God, not a single one.
But it would also tell us, when we were narrowing it down between candidates, how do you choose a leader? What do you look for? Well, this is a formula to find a certain kind of man that really could take on this responsibility.
Right, or woman, because we're not meaning to offend anybody here by using the term man. We're talking about the way that they look at their balance of power between men and women. The women choose based on these instructions, and the women have veto power and impeachment power. So their idea is that there is a balance of power, but there's equal power between men and women, which, of course, the U.S. democracy didn't start out that way. And a good deal of our Constitution is based on the great law of peace. For those of you that haven't listened in the past, this is why we talk about it so much, because a lot of our democracy is based on this. And given the fact that this is a divinely inspired act, in our opinion, but even if you didn't think that, even if you have no connection to spirituality at all, if you sit down and think about what we just said and the way Bob articulated how we would choose a leader, what we are looking for, why wouldn't you want to choose a leader that is putting the people before themselves? Just the fact that a lot of these people have been in a Congress that has given itself free health care while not giving it to us, that has allowed members of its Congress to get away with criminal behavior with a slap on the wrist. Just the fact that they give themselves a pension for life. All you have to do is serve for 2 years, and you're going to make exactly what you made in Congress. Or this, well, Congress is actually, let's get our terms clear here one more time. Congress is the House of Representatives and the Senate together. Okay? So senators and representatives make a pension for the rest of their lives after only serving for 2 years. So that doesn't happen for the rest of us, and that's our tax money. That is us working people. So if we're going to invest that much in our leadership, shouldn't it be people that want to put themselves before us? And sure as heck, before we turn over the reins of power to anyone else in the world, shouldn't it be people with those exact character qualities that we just mentioned? You certainly don't want... What do you want, China in charge? There was some other, and actually I like this guy, the guy that wrote Sapiens, right up until the point that he suggested, well, maybe we should look at China for leadership. China is let me just say this one more time, China is an authoritarian capitalist nation with 119 Fortune 500 companies, which is only 2 less than the United States has. We have 121 Fortune 500 companies, except no democracy there. Sure, they could make all kinds of laws about the environment because their president for life over there can do whatever he wants. And is that going to be in the best interest of the rest of the world? No, that is not going to be in the best interest of the rest of the world. So the thing is that we here in the United States, where we are still a powerhouse economy, where we are still the leading voice in democracy, the leading voice in people having a choice, in people living in a country where we are empowered to express ourselves, to create businesses, to create art, to create whatever we would like to create. Where we are still in that position, that is how we can have our greatest influence. And we are not, our leaders have not taken hold of that. That's the problem with the way the leadership is now, a tremendous lack of character.
I agree. It is a lack of character. And if you look at our choices, we are finding the lowest common denominator in humanity. That, in my way of looking at it,
you're right.
We have found the lowest common denominator in humanity. Now, I thought I have at least entertained the notion of Plato's idea of the philosopher king, that if somehow you could choose the right leader who had a background of understanding and was truly educated, and you could find somebody who was compassionate, that maybe that would be a better route than democracy as we know it. But I think instead, if you use the formula in the way that the Haudenosaunee have, that you have the best of both of those worlds.
Absolutely.
Because you have somebody, you will have found someone with the proper kind of character and a person who will make the right kind of decisions and will make decisions looking out for the good, truly for the good of the people. And if we go back another step in understanding this Haudenosaunee story of democracy and why it's important for us to look at, we can also look at the difference between the good mind and the quick mind.
Absolutely have to look at that. And I think that, that relates to something that Russell Means alluded to. I think one of the most important statements he made here about Western culture is that all of these philosophies that have come out, whether you're talking about Marxism, communism, capitalism, whether you're talking and I'm not talking about all capitalism, because actually there are some good things about capitalism. There are some good things about all of these systems. It's your approach. I think the problem with Marx mainly is that he was such a negative character. He saw the world in its negative form. And we've already talked about how bad that is for your brain. But what he talks about is are we just continuing with the same kind of authoritarian situation that has led us to the oligarchy that we have now in the United States, the authoritarianism that we see in China, what we see going on in Russia and Turkey, and places that claim to be one thing, but they're really not. They're another, because we're stuck, like Albert Einstein said, which I say on the show all the time. It is the theme of this show. You cannot solve a problem with the same mindset that created it. So we've got to get out of this European idea of constant hierarchy. And when you're talking about the philosopher king, you could look to Bhutan. I mean, Bhutan is the happiest country on earth, but what works in Bhutan, where they have a king, is the fact that they are all Buddhists. So there's a certain philosophy to Buddhism, that being raised in that philosophy to have compassion and to have kindness and to share. When you're raised in that philosophy, then yes, you're going to have that kind of philosopher king. But I totally agree with you that if we follow the Haudenosaunee rules, then we get the best of both worlds.
We absolutely do. And the Peacemaker gave us specific instructions on which mind to use, the good mind and the quick mind.
Exactly.
So rather than looking at good and evil in the world, the Peacemaker said that as human beings, we have a choice in every moment of which mind we're going to use, which harkens back to what you said earlier about making the decision about what to do out of panic, because the quick mind is the one that is quick to anger, it's quick to action, and it's slow to forgive. The good mind is the opposite. The good mind is slow to make decisions, slow to become angry, and quick to forgive others. So when we use, these are other instructions that are actually practically applicable in our daily lives as individuals, but also in our government decision making.
Exactly.
That we think about what we're doing. We take our time. And, you know, what's interesting to me is that in the earliest accounts of European settlers and explorers who came here to the Northeast wrote in their diaries and in their writings the frustration that they had in working with Indian people, because Indian people took so long to make decisions. And they were like, well, why can't you guys just decide quickly and act on it like we do? And the reason, from the Haudenosaunee perspective, and certainly other nations have used this as well, is that we need to engage in 7-generation thinking, which means that I can't make a decision today until I consider the impact on my children, my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, my great-great-grandchildren, my great-great-great-grandchildren, my great-great-great-great-grandchildren, and I already lost track, but one more than that. So clearly that takes a lot of time. That takes a lot of I guess the best way I can describe it is that you really have to remove yourself from the action of the moment to have that presence of mind.
Exactly.
And if you compare that with the way that politicians in our country make decisions, how do they make decisions? They make decisions based on lobbyists.
That's right. That's exactly it. So when
yelling at each other.
Right.
So for the Haudenosaunee, one person is allowed to speak at a time, and when a speaker is finished speaking, they give a 15-minute pause before the next person in case that person forgot something. Now compare that to our world, where one politician shouts the other one down.
Exactly. Or where even, you go to the recommendation of what happened in those town hall meetings, where the people, where you get the Antifa movement, and they do the whole, what is it, Noam Chomsky that started that whole thing about we don't even listen to the other side. We just shout and yell and shout and yell. And then you can't even hear. You're not respecting the other person being equal to you.
And if you're yelling at each other, what is the likelihood of you finding common ground?
Exactly.
And compromising?
Exactly. And that's when you look to these these teachings, when you look to the idea that we are all created equal, we are all entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, those are very high, lofty values. And when you accept those values, then you also have to accept great responsibility. We, the people, have to accept that responsibility. And our responsibility to the future has to do with who we are choosing as leaders. And we just have to start choosing better people. We, the people, have to say, it's enough. It's enough already. Russell Means, by the way, was a libertarian. For those of you unfamiliar with the fastest growing party in the United States, the libertarians are small government people. We are people who believe that our civil liberties are most important and limiting the size and scope of a federal government. We want to maximize political freedom and autonomy, freedom of choice, voluntary association, and individual judgment. So you could see why an American Indian as wise as Russell Means would choose to be a libertarian. And in this day and age, if you really want to undertake the responsibility of a government of the people and do what the Haudenosaunee did, then you have to stop voting for the lesser of two evils. We have to say, this is enough. We're done. We are done with you people. We don't believe a word you say. They've broken so many promises. And one of the character qualities is honesty. That's out the window. And it becomes what's happened in our country is we're just dogs fighting over a bone. And we're allowing that to happen. We're so afraid. We are allowing ourselves to be in the flight or fight mindset, where we cannot, as I read earlier, brain research for all of those of you who are so into science, you scientific materialists out there who think the whole world is only what you see in front of your face. Go with it, even though quantum physics is going to tell you 94% of what's in the universe we don't even know about, But okay, if the world is only about what's in front of your face and only about what science proves you cannot make a decent decision if you are constantly in fear. So, listen to science, be calm, and carry on, and be really, I loved when Russell Means said here, it's not revolutionary to continue something. That's not revolutionary. It's not revolutionary to use violence to solve your problems, Antifa people. That's fascism. There's nothing revolutionary about going, let's use violence. It's not revolutionary to put down somebody who had the strength to live in peace, like what's being done to Martin Luther King's legacy now. People making fun of Gandhi. This is our lower selves, and this goes back to what you're talking about with the quick mind. If we have leaders that set the example of the good mind, that set the example of putting others before themselves, then we have that chance to do that, but they're not out there. So we're going to have to demand it, which is why I say on this program all the time, anybody but a Democrat or a Republican in 2020. My timing. My timer's there. So thank you, Bobby.
Well, if I could just add one point to
Please
kind of
add.
close. I mean, we opened talking about the whole notion of climate change. And I think that we have built within this the formula that answers that question.
Absolutely.
If we make our decision based on 7 generations, then we immediately sort out our priorities in order to understand what is the most important thing to do now.
Right. And when you're dealing with somebody who is compassionate, then they can sit down and allay the fears. This is what I'm always saying. What we've done now is we've created an us or them situation. Instead of creating a we situation in our government, instead of saying, look, guys, this is what's going on. This is what we know. We've got to clean up the water. We've got to go to Nestle and tell them, sorry, you can't make a profit on water anymore. There are things that are economically going to change, but I'm also going to ask you out there, what sacrifices are you willing to make? Your phone's made with conflict minerals, so because of the fact that the Congo has the minerals that make your smartphone, there's war, there's child soldiers. There's death and dying and destruction. If your smartphone gets charged on a pad, you can't replace that battery. There's no way to get in there and do that. So what are you willing to sacrifice? What are you willing to do? What are you willing to give up? It really is what John Kennedy said a long time ago. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. And that is the way that the Haudenosaunee pick leaders. Ask not what someone else can do for you. If you're going to ask, that's what we call sacred reciprocity. If you're going to ask somebody to do something for you, you better be willing to give back. And I don't mean like tete-a-tete. I don't mean quid pro quo. I don't mean any of that. I mean that you are willing to make some sacrifice for the good of everyone, whatever that sacrifice is. And that sacrifice may be picking leaders who actually keep their promises. Oh my gosh, what a concept. So I think that's where we go back to the good mind, and the quick mind speaks to personal responsibility, which speaks to personal empowerment. And that's why we use that word so much. It's used all the time. But what does it really mean? It means that you take on the responsibility to see that we get the best and the brightest in power, not the people that want to be in power. Can you imagine what would happen if next November everybody just vote Green Party. If you're into the environment, vote for the Green Party. If you're into small government, vote Libertarian. I say that there are a ton of parties out there you could vote for other than these people that have been stealing your money for years and years and years. I mean, there's that new amendment floating around about Congress shall make no laws for itself that it doesn't apply to the people. If they're going to get pension, we should get pension. That's our money. If they're going to get free health care, we should get free health care. And all those people that voted that in, they should be immediately voted. The Klan mothers would have kicked them out because they did not put their people before themselves. That is the number one requirement of democratic leadership, of real republic leadership. And it's going to require us to make the sacrifice of not having everything happen tomorrow. We're going to have to get out of our quick mind because we should come to consensus because, like the peacemaker said, if you want peace, you have to decide, do you want to be right or do you want to be fair? And fair is the only way to go because everybody thinks they're right? So it's not an us or them situation to change this. It's just like Russell Means said. Doesn't matter which side you pick right now. It's just a continuation of a philosophy that has not succeeded, that has not worked, that is arrived at by force, and that takes away your power. So reclaim it. That's what empowerment means. Sometimes I think that word gets thrown around a little bit too much, though I do love it, so I'm keeping it. But it is really think about what it means to be empowered. It doesn't mean you're screaming and yelling and calling names. If you're screaming and yelling and calling names at somebody that disagrees with you, you're part of the problem. That's violence of your word. If you're acting immorally, you're part of the problem. If you're justifying doing something immoral, you're part of the problem. So stop it. It's like that Bob Newhart thing I watched the other day. Look it up on YouTube. Bob Newhart has this very funny routine he did about telling he's a shrink, telling his client to just stop it. That's his method of treatment. So, I mean, that really is something we have to do. So we only have a minute left here, my dear. Any final words, final thoughts?
Yeah, we want to live in a country of freedom, and ultimate freedom brings ultimate responsibility.
Exactly.
Those are my closing words.
And I love those closing words because that is the responsibility that we each have to accept, and we have to stop all of this name calling, all of the things that belittle us. We have to end. That has to go away. It's not revolutionary to call names. It's not rebellion. It's not any of those things. It doesn't make you more right than the other person. So try to keep that in mind as you're making decisions. And so I want to wish you all a wonderful, wonderful Indigenous Peoples Day. And I want to thank you for listening and to wish you all, as always, peace, love, and joy. Thank you.